Welcome to Touching Life Deeply channel. This research series is published on the channel at 8:0 p.m.
And welcome. Yes, today we are really diving deep into something fundamental, something that affects us all.
Yeah.
The biology of how we age.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We usually just think about aging as, well, birthday's passing, more candles on the cake.
Right.
But the real story, the one that really shapes our health, our vitality as we get older, that's happening inside us, way down at the cellular level. And we hear these terms all the time, right? Like oxidative stress or inflammation. They get thrown around a lot with aging.
Yeah, they do.
But what do they actually mean? What are they doing in there? And maybe most importantly, how does it all fit together? Because the research seems to suggest it's all connected.
That's exactly what we want to unpack today. We've gone through a whole stack of scientific reviews, recent papers, and we're aiming to pull out the core ideas about these sort of biological gears of aging, trying to untangle how these key things, oxidative stress, inflammation, these senescent cells, even our mitochondria, the powerhouses, how they're not working in isolation. They're interacting often in ways that, well, drive the aging process.
Yeah.
And then based on that, what do these sources hint at? Are there ways to influence this, maybe promote health span, not just lifespan, but healthy years?
So think of this as your guide to the cellular story of aging, pulled straight from what the science is telling us right now.
Okay, so where do we start? Let's begin right at the cell level. What happens as our cells get older? A really key concept here is cellular senescence.
Ah, senescence. That's when cells just stop dividing, right? Like they hit some kind of limit.
Pretty much. It's often called the Hayflick limit. Think of it like a cell clock running out, or maybe the cell deciding to, well, retire from dividing.
Okay.
But it's not always a planned retirement. Often it's triggered by stress, damage, wear and tear inside the cell.
So it's less like retiring and more like being forced out due to like hazardous conditions.
That's a good way to put it. And the sources really stress that aging isn't just wrinkles and gray hair. It involves these really deep, profound changes in how our cells actually work.
Okay, so what's causing that wear and tear? You mentioned oxidative stress earlier. Where does that fit in?
Right, oxidative stress. It's a major player. Think of it like sparks flying off a running machine. Our cells naturally produce these reactive molecules, things called reactive oxygen species, or ROS, just as part of doing their job.
Like exhaust fumes.
Kind of, yeah, especially from mitochondria when they're making energy. And these ROS molecules, they aren't all bad. They actually have roles in cell signaling, believe it or not.
Okay, but. I sense a but coming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets tricky. If you get too many of these reactive molecules building up, maybe because of things like pollution, UV radiation from the sun, smoking, maybe a really unbalanced diet, or, and this is crucial, those mitochondria getting old and dysfunctional themselves, then you get an imbalance. Too many sparks. That's oxidative stress.
Okay, so an overload. And what does that overload do to the cell?
Well, it's damaging. It basically starts rusting the cellular machinery. It damages critical things like our DNA, proteins, lipids, the fats that make up cell membranes.
Wow.
And the sources call the debris from this damaged DAMPs, damage-associated molecular patterns. Think of them like little molecular red flags saying, help, damage here.
DAMPs. Okay, so the cell's being damaged, sending out distress signals. Does the body fight back?
It tries. We have antioxidant defense systems, repair mechanisms like an internal cleanup crew and repair shop. There's a key pathway called NRF2 that helps with this. But as we age, these defense systems, while they tend to decline, they get less efficient. The cleanup crew gets slower, maybe misses some spots.
So you've got more damage happening from oxidative stress, and the systems meant to handle it are slowing down.
Yeah.
That sounds problematic.
It really is. And those DAMPs, those distress signals, they're really important because they trigger the next big player, inflammation.
Ah, inflammation. Okay, normally we think of that as your ankle swelling up after a sprain. It's supposed to be helpful, right? Healing.
Absolutely. Acute inflammation, that short-term response is essential. It's the body rushing resources to fight off an infection or repair an injury. It recognizes invaders or those DAMPs from damaged cells and sends in the troops.
Okay.
But here's the critical link the sources make. What happens when you have cells constantly being damaged, or those senescent cells we mentioned earlier, just sticking around and continuously releasing those DAMPs?
The inflammation doesn't stop.
Exactly. That temporary, helpful response becomes chronic. Persistent, low level, but system-wide. And that is what researchers call inflammaging.
Inflammaging, right?
Ugh.
Chronic, low-grade inflammation that comes with getting older.
Precisely. It's not like the dramatic swelling of an injury. It's more like a constant low simmer of inflammation throughout the body. You can often measure higher levels of certain inflammatory molecules like IL-6 or IL-1 beta circulating in the blood.
And why is that simmer such a big deal?
Because the research consistently points to this chronic inflammaging as a major driver, a significant risk factor for a whole host of age-related diseases.
Like what?
Things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, many neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's. It seems like this constant inflammation isn't just a side effect of aging, it's actively contributing to the decline and increasing disease risk. It might even be a way to measure how fast someone is aging biologically.
Wow. So it's not just background noise. It's actively fanning the flames of disease.
That's the picture emerging.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, the sources mention that some of these inflammatory molecules like IL-6 and IL-1 beta are actually being investigated as potential targets for drugs, say in conditions like atherosclerosis.
To try and cool down the inflammation. Right?
Exactly. Whereas other markers like C-reactive protein or CRP might be more like warning lights. Predictive biomarkers showing inflammation is high, but maybe not the direct cause you'd target. Understanding that difference is key for developing treatments.
Okay, let's circle back to those senescent cells, the retired ones. You said they're triggered by damage and they release DAMPs. But do they do anything else to contribute to this inflammaging picture?
Oh, absolutely. They're not just passive bystanders. Once a cell becomes senescent, it often develops something called the SASP, stands for senescence-associated secretory phenotype.
Okay, break that down. Secretory phenotype, does that mean they're just leaking stuff?
It's more active than leaking. It means these senescent cells start deliberately secreting a whole cocktail of molecules into their environment.
And what's in the cocktail?
Well, guess what? A big part of it is more pro-inflammatory signals. Things like those interleukins, IL-6, IL-8, IL-1 beta, plus other factors that can mess with the surrounding tissue.
Wait, so the senescent cells themselves are actively pumping out inflammatory stuff?
Yes. That's a really key point from the sources. They're not just damaged, they become little inflammation factories, constantly broadcasting these signals that fuel the chronic the inflammaging we were just talking about.
So it's a vicious cycle. Damage causes senescence, and senescence causes more inflammation, which probably causes more damage.
You've got it. The SASP is often triggered by the same things that cause the senescence in the first place, like DNA damage. It creates this self-perpetuating loop. That's why there's so much excitement around developing senolytics.
Senolytics, what are those?
They're drugs being designed to specifically find and eliminate these senescent cells. The idea is if you can clear out these inflammation factories, maybe you can break that cycle, reduce inflammaging, and improve health in later life. It's a really active area of research.
That makes a lot of sense. Remove the troublemakers. Now, you mentioned mitochondria earlier, too, as a source of oxidative stress, but also as our energy producers. How else do they fit into the aging puzzle?
Mitochondria are just fascinatingly central to all this. They have this dual role, right?
Yeah.
Powering the cell, but also being the main source of those ROS, the oxidative sparks.
Right.
As we age, the DNA inside mitochondria, they have their own little bit of DNA, can accumulate mutations, damage. This leads to mitochondria becoming less efficient, dysfunctional.
And dysfunctional mitochondria.
They tend to leak more ROS. So the power plants get old and faulty and start producing even more pollution, adding to oxidative stress and accelerating that whole damaging cycle.
So they become part of the problem, not just the solution for energy.
Exactly. Mitochondrial dysfunction is really strongly linked to the aging process itself and to many of those age-related diseases. But interestingly, the sources also mention something called mitochondrial hormesis.
Hormesis, what's that?
It's the idea that maybe very low levels of stress, including a small amount of ROS for mitochondria, might actually be beneficial. It could trigger the cell's defense and repair systems, making them stronger, like a vaccine primes the immune system.
Huh. So it's not just all ROS is bad. The dose makes the poison, or the medicine.
Potentially, yes. It suggests the relationship is more complex. It's about balance, not just elimination. And this connects back to therapies, too. Some senolytic strategies actually work by targeting proteins in the mitochondria that normally stop damaged cells from undergoing programmed cell death.
Okay, so we've covered damage to DNA, membranes, mitochondria going bad. What about proteins, the actual workers in the cell?
Good question. Proteins are crucial. They do almost everything. But as cells age, the systems that ensure proteins are folded correctly and that misfolded ones get cleaned up, well, those systems can decline too.
So proteins start to mess up.
They can misfold and then clump together, aggregate. The sources use this great term, age aggregate.
Gauge aggregates. I like that. Descriptive.
Isn't it? It emphasizes these insoluble clumps of protein found accumulating in aged tissues. And these age aggregates, they share characteristics with the protein clumps we see in really serious age-related diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or even type 2 diabetes.
So similar problems happening.
It seems like it. When proteins misfold or clump, they can't do their job properly. Or worse, they can become toxic themselves, interfering with essential processes like communication between nerve cells, metabolism, or that cellular cleanup process, autophagy.
And where does this happen most?
The sources suggest it's particularly noticeable in tissues where cells don't divide much, like the brain. Those cells are around for a long time, so these aggregates can just build up over decades.
Man, it really paints a picture. Stress, inflammation, zombie cells causing trouble, failing power plants, gummed-up protein machinery. What about the basic instruction manual, the DNA itself? Beyond the oxidative damage.
Well, there's the telomere story, those caps on the ends of chromosomes. They tend to shorten each time most cells divide, acting like a kind of cellular division counter.
The Hayflick limit again.
Right. And while telomere shortening is part of the picture, the sources emphasize that oxidative damage happens all over the DNA, not just the ends. Plus, there's a connection between telomeres getting too short or damaged and, you guessed it, chronic inflammation. The enzyme that helps maintain telomerase, its activity, also drops in most cells as we age.
Okay. And then there's epigenetics. That's about how genes are used, not the genes themselves, right?
Exactly. Think of your DNA sequence as the letters in a book. Epigenetics is like the punctuation, the highlighting, the sticky notes controlling which chapters are read, when, and how loudly. These marks on the DNA or its packaging proteins can change throughout life.
Influenced by
Lots of things. Our environment, our diet, stress. And these epigenetic patterns change quite predictably with age. So much so that researchers can now look at these epigenetic signatures and get a pretty accurate measure of your biological age.
like a molecular clock that's maybe more accurate than your birth certificate.
In terms of cellular health, potentially yes. Your chronological age and biological age, measured epigenetically, might not be the same.
That is wild. And does this connect to diseases too?
Oh, definitely. The sources mention specific epigenetic changes seen in brain cells that are linked to problems with learning and memory in conditions like Alzheimer's. Synaptic plasticity, how connections between neurons change, seems affected.
And can anything be done?
Well, here's something really interesting. Some studies, mostly in animal models so far, suggest that using drugs that target some of these epigenetic writers or erasers, enzymes that add or remove these marks, might actually help restore some lost brain function. It's early days, but it's a very exciting avenue.
Wow. Okay, so we have this whole constellation of issues. Oxidative stress, inflammation, senescence, mitochondria failing, proteins clumping, telomeres shortening, epigenetic drift. Feels like a lot of separate problems, but you said earlier they're all connected, regulated somehow.
Yes, exactly. So what does this all mean? The really crucial takeaway from these sources is that these aren't just happening randomly or independently. They're all interconnected, and they're influenced, even orchestrated, by fundamental cellular signaling pathways. Think of them as master control systems.
Master regulators. Okay, tell me about those.
Broadly speaking, you can think of two opposing sides. On one side, you have pathways that get activated when the cell senses stress or low energy or limited nutrients.
The, times are tough signals.
Kind of, yeah. Pathways like AMPK, sirtuins, sestrins. These tend to promote protective and cleanup activities. They boost antioxidant defenses, fire up autophagy, that's cellular recycling, and they tend to put the brakes on inflammation. They help the cell hunker down, repair, and survive.
Okay, the defense and repair team, what's the other side?
The other side involves pathways that are activated by nutrient abundance. Plenty of energy, plenty of amino acids coming in. Think of the insulin IGF-1 signaling pathway, or mTOR. These are the growth and build signals.
Makes sense when you're young, growing.
Absolutely essential then. But the issue is, if these growth pathways are constantly switched on, highly active throughout adult life, well, they tend to inhibit those beneficial defense and repair pathways, like autophagy, and they can actually promote inflammation.
So too much grow can suppress the cleanup and repair.
That seems to be a major part of the story. The balance between these two systems, the stress response repair side and the nutrient sensing growth side, seems absolutely critical for healthy aging.
And what happens to that balance as we age?
Well, the sources suggest it gets deregulated. Often the growth pathways become sort of chronically overactive, or the stress response pathways become less sensitive, less effective. This tilt contributes to more oxidative stress, less efficient cleanup of damage, and that persistent chronic inflammation.
And this is where things like diet and exercise come in, maybe.
Exactly. This is why there's so much interest in things like caloric restriction or exercise, because these lifestyle factors, as discussed in the sources, are known to influence these very master regulatory pathways.
Also,
Well, exercise, for example, can activate AMPK, the times or tough signal, promoting beneficial adaptations. Caloric restriction, or fasting, tends to dial down the nutrient-sensing pathways like mTOR and activate the stress response ones. They help shift the balance back towards maintenance and repair.
so the advice we always hear gets a deeper biological meaning here.
It really does. And some drugs being studied for aging, like metformin or rapamycin, are thought to work, at least in part, by tweaking these same master pathways.
Okay, so let's try and tie this all together then. It sounds like a real cascade effect.
It does look like a cascade, or maybe a series of interconnected feedback loops. You start with stressors, maybe environmental, maybe internal metabolic stress.
Right.
That leads to oxidative stress, damage to molecules like DNA and proteins, creating those damps.
Okay.
Oxidative stress also damages the mitochondria, which then produce more oxidative stress and contributes to cells becoming senescent.
The retired cells,
Right. Then the damps from damage and the SH-quay from the senescent cells, they both fuel chronic inflammation and inflammaging.
which causes more problems.
Yeah, chronic inflammation seems linked to telomere dysfunction and perhaps more senescence. Meanwhile, the failing mitochondria, the oxidative stress, and the decline in cleanup pathways like autophagy, that all contributes to proteins misfolding and forming those age aggregates.
And the epigenetic clock is ticking along with all this.
Exactly. The epigenetic changes reflect all this going on and probably influence it too. And the whole downward spiral seems to be accelerated when those master nutrient and energy sensing pathways get stuck in the wrong gear, favoring constant growth over repair. It's a complex web.
It definitely sounds complex,
Mm.
but also understanding it feels powerful. So why should you, listening right now, really care about all this intricate cellular biology?
Well, because these fundamental mechanisms, oxidative stress, inflammation, senescence, all of it, they aren't just abstract science. They are believed to be the underlying roots of many of the major diseases that impact us as we get older.
Heart disease, neurodegeneration, diabetes, cancer.
Exactly. By understanding these root causes, researchers can develop much smarter strategies to potentially prevent or delay these conditions. It's about tackling the foundations, not just the symptoms.
And the goal isn't just living longer, right? It's about
Health span, that's the key word. Extending the number of years we live in good health, free from debilitating age-related diseases. Most of the potential interventions discussed in these sources, whether it's senolytics, anti-inflammatories, or drugs targeting those master pathways, are really aimed at improving health span.
And as you mentioned, it puts our own choices into perspective too.
Yeah.
Diet, exercise, managing stress, they gain real significance when you see how they might directly influence these deep cellular processes we've been talking about.
Absolutely. It connects everyday life to fundamental biology.
Okay, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into how interconnected all these mechanisms are. Oxidative stress, inflammation, senescence, mitochondria, proteins, telomeres, epigenetics, all tangled together and regulated by those master switches. So given just how complex and intertwined it all is, here's a final thought for you to consider. Does this deep interplay suggest that the most effective strategies in the future for promoting health span won't be just single magic bullets, but will probably need to target multiple pathways at the same time, a kind of combination approach?
That's a really critical question and one that the research community is actively grappling with right now.
And finally, some of the information in this research episode has been compiled from public sources and scientific publications. We are not responsible for any misuse of the content beyond its intended purpose of education and raising awareness. Don't forget to follow Touching Life Deeply so you won't miss our next meaningful insights.